I move second reading of Bill 15, an act to amend the Highway Traffic Act to create an offence of contravention causing death or serious bodily harm.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Ms. French has moved second reading of Bill 15, an act to amend the Highway Traffic Act to create an offence of contravention causing death or serious bodily harm. Pursuant to Standing Order 100, the member has 12 minutes for a presentation.
Thank you, Speaker. I am grateful to be able to debate this important issue today, but this House has been discussing this important justice issue for 20 years. Today, we are debating Bill 15, the Fairness for Road Users Act 2022. It has a long history, and I am glad to be able to share the voices of some of the people who have been relentless in seeing justice through for loved ones lost and those who have survived terrible collisions, who will never be the same. I want to thank Jerry Rhodes, the Provincial Government Liaison Officer of the Bikers' Rights Organization, Brian Burnett, also with BRO, who is joining us here today, and the folks from Good Roads who recognize the importance of this issue, the families and advocates who have shared their hurt and their voices with me. Speaker, this bill and its road began in 2002 north of Batchewana, Ontario. Wanda and James Harrison were visiting from the States and were touring on their motorcycles, enjoying Ontario. A man from Etobicoke made an unsafe left turn across their path and killed both of them. The OPP closed the Trans-Canada Highway for 6 or 7 hours while they gathered all evidence, and several days later, they laid a charge of unsafe turn. Police could not lay a more serious charge, hence the Highway Traffic Act infraction. The maximum penalty was $500. As shared by Jerry Rhodes from the Bikers' Rights Organization, quote, "A member of our organization was in attendance at the trial of the accused. The justice at trial, prior to formally passing sentence, spoke to the accused in open court and stated words to the effect of, 'Had you been charged under the criminal code, I could have given you a more appropriate penalty. As it was, you were charged under the Highway Traffic Act, and the maximum penalty I can apply is a $500 fine. 2 people died that day. You have to live with that for the rest of your life.'" Speaker, we know that terrible things can happen on the roads. When people violate the Highway Traffic Act and someone dies or suffers serious bodily harm as the result of that violation, there is not a significant penalty that can be given upon sentencing. Too many families have been devastated by a judge's inability to do more than issue a $500 fine, which is a slap in the face to loved ones already suffering. Survivors of a collision as a result of a Highway Traffic Act violation are often lucky to be alive and are heading to a very changed future, and they are told at sentencing that their suffering is worth no more than $500. Brian Burnett is joining us today at Queen's Park and is also a member of the Bikers' Rights Organization. Brian has been here a few times to see various incarnations of this bill come before this House, and welcome back, Brian. Brian was also a victim of a left-turning vehicle. Although he survived the accident, Brian is now permanently disabled and requires medical prosthesis to allow him to walk. I want to share Mr. Burnett's account of what happened to him. Quote, "I am also a survivor of an auto motorcycle collision back on October 7, 2003. She failed to ensure the way was clear before she committed to her left turn across my straight line of travel as I was coming up beside an also left-turning city bus on my left side. Got to the front of the bus and the 95 Honda Civic she was driving cut across my path. I hit the right front wheel area and was ejected off the bike, hit the fender, hit the hood twice, and then hit the pavement on the other side of the now stopped car. I remember the distinct sound of each contact with either the car or the pavement. Shattered the hip socket, broke the tibia and fibula below the knee and above the ankle. 2.5 months in hospital, 3 separate surgeries in Ottawa. After an to install surgical implants around my shattered hip socket, 2 implants just below my knee and 2 implants in the area of my ankle. Have sustained nerve damage in the knee area, so I can barely move my ankle down and can't move it up at all. I can barely wiggle some of the toes, and half of my foot is numb on the surface, but I can still walk after a fashion with a limp. She was charged with a turn not in safety, a $500 fine. She didn't set out to change the course of my life, but she did." End quote. Brian was one of the lucky ones. His friend Chris Mayhew was not. Chris was very active in the biker community, and I've been told was a great friend. And he was killed on the road July 7, 2001. Brian recalled to me that the judge's hands were tied and that he wished he could have issued more than a $500 fine, which was and is the maximum allowed under the Highway Traffic Act. Chris's death was the inspiration for the Fallen Riders Memorial. Mr. Burnett is the Bikers' Rights Organization's Fallen Riders Memorial Coordinator. For many years pre-pandemic, BRO would gather on the Queen's Park front lawn for a memorial service on the last Saturday in May, honouring fallen motorcycle riders. I hope the way is clear for them to hold the memorial again this May. Speaker, it isn't right and it isn't fair. As Brian pointed out, when someone is killed as a result of the Highway Traffic Act violation, the charge is an HTA infraction. So even if charged and sentenced, as he said, quote, it doesn't go on your license, doesn't go on your record. A turn not in safety doesn't go anywhere except on your own conscience. People are dying and we want to have justice for the families. End quote. I also want to thank Ray Damoud for taking the time to talk with me. As Mr. Damoud told me, quote, it's sad to relive an incident that brought myself and the community such grief. Stan Crocker, a close friend and business partner, was struck down on his motorcycle by a driver making an illegal left-hand turn. Upon arriving at the scene, watching my friend die was devastating. Going to the court hearing was almost as devastating, as the judge said he wished he could impose a much harsher penalty for the manslaughter, but his hands were tied and sentencing could only result in a $500 fine. This incident has haunted me ever since, as the punishment does not align with the crime. End quote. I'm sure that everyone here can understand the injustice of a measly $500 fine in the face of devastating loss or injury. This ought to be a quick solve, but so far that hasn't happened. I want to say that historically, various government responses to this issue have shown either a limited understanding or a lack of interest or will. Thousands of signatures on petitions, 4 separate bills, amendments voted down at committee, missed opportunities. I will say, however, that I am hopeful that we can move this ahead and make some important changes. I have appreciated that this Minister of Transportation has made herself and her staff available to discuss this issue and some of the connecting pieces, like how this would impact the Ministry of the Attorney General and the justice aspects. I know we aren't there yet, but the spirit and intent of this bill are sound. I believe that the minister understands the inadvertent harm being caused to grieving families, and I am hopeful that she and this government will let this issue move forward to be fixed. Speaker, some of the questions I've had to answer about this are around the nature of the charge and the fact that Ontario does have some strong penalties for various offences. So, Speaker, basically it is this. Police may respond to a collision and see the awful carnage and well know the devastating loss to a family, but they can't upsize the charge. They have to lay a charge that they can support with evidence. Only an evidence-based charge will stand up in court. An improper turn or flipping an unsafe U-turn may kill someone, but it still is technically a minor infraction. A judge also cannot upsize an HTA sentence. They have no tools to reach for beyond the maximum of $500. The driver may be a menace or a serial offender or unlucky, but the judge is not allowed to factor in any of these circumstances at sentencing. I believe a judge should be allowed to use their discretion. Also, let's recognize that the high penalties the government is likely to mention in their remarks are for careless driving. But my understanding is that more than 80% of these charges are pled down to lesser charges, like an improper U-turn. Almost no one is convicted of careless driving. They plead down. What we think is happening in the courts is not happening. We don't see closure for families. There isn't much justice for survivors or surviving families right now. I am proposing this very simple bill to give the judges access to higher penalties and options if the charge sticks and a driver is sentenced. It increases the penalty to be in line with careless driving and increases the minimum fine to $2,000 with a maximum of $50,000 and outlines a range of penalties, including that a judge can suspend a license or permit, which currently, unbelievably, is not an option. There are others who understand that this matters and that this change is a part of a much larger need for better and safer roads. This is from a letter from Good Roads, who are here today at Queen's Park. They said, "Dear Ms. French, I am writing to you on behalf of the Good Roads Board of Directors, who recently passed a resolution supporting Bill 15, the Fairness for Road Users Act 2022. Good Roads believes that action must be taken to better protect the safety of vulnerable road users throughout the province, and that this bill will have an impact in that regard." And that is from Paul Shopman, President of Good Roads. Speaker, there are many measures that should be law to make our roads safer. Today's private member's bill is one of those, and out of respect for the 20 years of tireless work done by the folks I've been speaking about, it is a standalone piece. But it is a piece of a broader puzzle to address the need for victim impact statements in education, broader vulnerable road users definitions, and a host of other measures that would both make our roads safer and would support survivors and surviving loved ones. I also want the government to consider the tremendous work done by my colleagues who continue to work with advocacy and safety groups across the province on behalf of vulnerable road users. The MPP for University Rosedale, the MPP from Ottawa Centre have been working tirelessly on vulnerable road user legislation that would ensure mandatory added penalties are included with the sentence when someone is seriously injured or killed. Please pass this bill, but see it as a part of a comprehensive strategy to make things better and safer for all vulnerable road users. During the committee hearing for Bill 282, the Moms Act, we heard from road safety groups and individuals. We heard from Jessica Speaker and Heather Sim from Friends and Families for Safe Streets, who spoke from personal experience. Heather Sim, the daughter of Gary Sim, told the committee, quote, "On June 30th, 2017, my dad was riding his bike home from running errands. He was riding straight past a plaza when a driver in a van drove up behind him, passed him, and turned right into him. He spent 2 days on life support before he died. For my dad's case, the driver was charged with turn not in safety. He was found guilty and given the maximum fine of $500 and 2 demerit points. There was no license suspension. At sentencing, the judge called a recess to determine if she could increase the fine as she felt this was not sufficient. But unfortunately, her hands were tied by the Highway Traffic Act. My dad's life was worth so much more than $500. I asked her if she would support my proposed legislative change to change the penalties, and she told me, quote, "I think that would be fantastic because that happened in our exact case, and the judge made it clear that she thought this should be a lot higher based on what happened, but her hands were tied, and she made that very clear at the sentencing." End quote. Jessica told us, quote, "In 2015, I was riding my bike to work in a straight line on a bright morning with the right-of-way when an oncoming driver made a left turn and slammed her large SUV into me. When she struck me, she broke my spine, she inflicted a brain injury, and she did such extensive damage to the side of my body that she hit that I developed a large blood clot in my leg. Later, a piece of that blood clot broke off, chewed through my heart, and landed across both lobes of my lung. In effect, her actions nearly killed me twice." End quote. Just talked about the need for justice for victims and said, "The fact that Gary Sim's life was officially deemed to be worth $500 is a disgusting insult, and that the value of my health and my future was $300 hurts me every single day." End quote. I don't know how to explain it in a way that would convince this government more than what I've shared from survivors and surviving loved ones. Their stories are haunting. Please listen to them. Please pass my private member's bill so that when bad things happen, we don't add insult to injury and that we can finally have some fairness for road users. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. Further debate? The member for Brampton East. Thank you. Further debate? The member for Oshawa has 2 minutes to reply.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for their comments on this legislation. I would actually like to say a thank you to the Minister of Transportation and staff for moving this forward. I have been working with them, and I appreciate that this time might be different. What we have been hearing is what we've been seeing. What's seen in the courtroom doesn't reflect what is needed to keep streets safer or to have some kind of justice for families. The fact of the matter is that while this government increased penalties for careless driving causing bodily harm or death in narrow circumstances, it isn't addressing the shortcomings of the Highway Traffic Act, which still allows nearly all drivers who kill or seriously injure others to avoid those significant consequences, and that's the reality of what's happening. I want judges to have the tools they need and the discretion, because we have heard from families who've said that the judges' hands were tied and that they were quite frustrated in their decisions. They've said, if I'm allowed, all I'm allowed to do is issue a $500 fine, which adds insult to injury when people have lost a loved one. The police are frustrated. They lay a charge. They watch people plead down or watch during sentencing, while the maximum $500 penalty only adds harm to a family's loss. As we heard from Heather Sim at committee, she said, quote, "With our case, it was a turn not in safety because they knew that they definitely could charge that. They could prove that, and he would be found guilty of that. If they were to up it to the dangerous driving charge, there was the risk of him walking with absolutely no charges. But to add to that, he drove away from the scene of the crash, and he always drove. There was never even a license suspension in his case." End quote. Speaker, no one sets out in the morning to kill someone on the road, and we know that. This is not about criminal intent. When someone does something that is in contravention of the Highway Traffic Act and something horrible happens, families are left with that slap on the wrist, $500. Their loved one's life was only worth, at most, $500. This increases the potential penalties to be in line with careless driving that people have said is needed. I want to thank Jerry and Brian and Heather and Jessica and Ray for sharing their words with this legislature and those who know the impact of this bill. Today, I am thinking of Wanda and James Harrison, Chris Mayhew, Stan Crocker, and Gary Sim. I appreciate that we are looking to pass this bill, so together we can fix this. Thank you, Speaker.
Right on.
Thank you. The time provided for private members' public business has expired. Ms. French has moved second reading of Bill 15, an act to amend the Highway Traffic Act to create an offence of contravention causing death or serious bodily harm. Is it the pleasure of the House that the motion carry? Carry. Carry. Pursuant to Standing Order 100H, the bill is referred to the Committee of the Whole House unless...
I would like to refer it to the Standing Committee on Heritage, Infrastructure and Cultural Policy.
Is it the majority in favor of this bill being referred to the Standing Committee on Heritage as stated by the member? Agreed. So the bill is referred to the Standing Committee on Heritage, Infrastructure and the one you said.
Cultural Policy.
Cultural Policy. Thank you.